is a tiny country about the size of the state of Delaware, located in the Persian Gulf. It has the fourth highest GDP per capita of any nation on Earth, twice that of the USA, and is still growing fast, by 30% last year. Until last century, though, no real states existed in Arabia, and the black liquid which spewed out of the ground was of little interest to the Western powers which passed through the area. Portugal came and left Qatar in the 16th century, and while the small pearl fishing and trading outpost of Doha was sporadically occupied by the Ottomans and Muscat for strategic reasons, when the British arrived in 1916, the town, which would one day become Qatar's glittering capital, remained little more than a collection of tents accumulating under the fierce Arabian sun. Under the British, Qatar was finally structured into a recognizable state, gaining independence in 1971 with the Al Thani dynasty established as rulers to govern in accordance with the strict and austere principles of fundamentalist Wahhabi Islam. But then, just before the British withdrawal, gas was discovered under the desolate sands, but the Al Thani dynasty would have to wait for another 2 decades before the technology became available to extract it and sell it abroad. Since that became possible, however, Qatar has gained more wealth than they are able to deal with by themselves. The Al Thani standard is now the flag of one of the richest nations on Earth. Qatari citizens pay no income tax and are given most of their public utilities, such as water and electricity, for free. Land is given to Qatari citizens for free, and interest-free loans are issued to build on it. The Qatari government pays for their citizens' healthcare and education, even when they go to study abroad. But this is not the type of monarchy which exists in Britain. The Al Thani family and their favourites dominate nearly all of the senior executive positions of power in Qatar and continue to rule in accordance with the strict Islamic values which they do not share with the West, or indeed with most of the people living in Qatar itself, because today, of the 2.5 million Qatari residents, barely 1 in 6 are actually citizens. In order to build their immense wealth, Qatar have imported their workforce as well as their commercial and social infrastructure. Of the workers who flock to Qatar, some are impoverished manual labourers that the country needs to keep the roads working and the streets clean, and some are skilled and wealthy business owners. But every foreigner who sets up a business in Qatar must have a Qatari sponsor, who receives a large cut of the profit without making any investment. As obtaining Qatari citizenship is nearly impossible, few in the country enjoy the full rights of citizens. However, as long as Qatar remain immensely wealthy, eager for lucrative business, and a major non-NATO ally, Western governments, corporations, and academia are happy to turn a blind eye to Qatar's exploitative economic model. The West, its culture, laws, and its freedoms were formed over centuries of compromise and interplay between civil society, religions, markets, and government forces. But Qatari wealth is not built on this foundation. Qatar's wealth bubbles out of the ground without commercial or political compromise to the hegemony of one ruling family and their ideology of radical Islam. If Qatar have enough money to buy their own political reality at home and abroad, regardless of economic sense or productive capacity, well then that's their problem. Our problem is that we sell it to them. Qatar's £10 billion London property empire now includes the Connaught Hotel, Claridge's, Harrods, £2 billion 95% stake in the Shard, a quarter of the central district of Mayfair, now known as Little Doha, and swathes of London's Docklands CBD. In addition, they have brought commercial infrastructure such as Barclays, Sainsbury's, and even Heathrow Airport, totaling to about £40 billion of British assets and more property than the Duke of Westminster and even the British Crown itself. There's nothing necessarily wrong with this in itself. We should be flattered that our culture, institutions, and brands are most valuable commodities that the wealthiest nations can get their hands on. But we are about to learn a valuable lesson that when you don't stand up for your society today, you will be forced to stand up for somebody else's society tomorrow. Qatari joint ventures with news networks, universities, governments, and corporations are undermining our society with a hostile ideology which aims to destroy the very civilization which attracts Qataris to our shores in the first place. Qatar's state-run media network, Al Jazeera, has already been banned in Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Jordan, and Egypt for being sympathetic to Qatar's radical associates, Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban. But while other networks like Russia Today, Voice of Europe, RIA Novosti, Izvestia, and Rossiyskaya Gazeta have already been banned by the European Union for dissemination of misinformation, Qatar have learned that with Western governments, you can pay to play. During the Iraq War, Al Jazeera would hide their camera crews next to roadside bombs as American soldiers drove by. When the bombs were detonated, the camera crews would record the explosions and sometimes the faces and battered bodies of American soldiers, all of which they broadcast. So Al Jazeera were directly collaborating with anti-US forces in the battlefield, yet Al Jazeera have risen in prominence to become one of the largest news networks in the West, and now they are collaborating with Northwest University in the USA to provide Qatari journalism students with American scholarships. When does a global media outlet become a global propaganda machine? Accusations are often made about the BBC, the UK's national broadcaster, for its editorial bias, but at least the UK is a democracy with an established opposition, and the BBC has a clear editorial line. Al Jazeera, on the other hand, is curated entirely by one feudal government of radical Muslims looking to replace America's hegemony in the Middle East. One of the great public relations victory of our times has been Qatar's use of the left-wing calling cards, such as the Pride movement, to secure the support of Western liberals for the Arab Spring, the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, and Hamas. Qatar uses its news network abroad to support the very ideologies in the West which it prohibits at home. And when a network cynically produces two different narratives for two separate audiences, you know that subversion and not truth is the highest priority. Naive Westerners who repeat contradicted slogans like gays for Palestine show that Qatar's strategy is working. Do we really want Qatar caroling gullible Westerners into their ideological ranks of one of the most regressive regimes on earth under the pretense of a social justice which they themselves don't believe in? Expressions of homosexuality or even solidarity with homosexuals are illegal in Qatar and considered a capital offense by many of Qatar's ideological allies. Western football teams have to cover up their solidarity rainbow flags when they play a match in Doha. So there is no doubt that Qatar promote the Pride movement in the West precisely because they view it as socially destructive. When Rolls-Royce started selling their cars abroad, they removed their famous Spirit of Ecstasy emblem from the cars they exported to the Muslim world because it depicts a naked woman. Now, you can remove the Spirit of Ecstasy from a Rolls-Royce and it's still a Rolls-Royce. But you can't build a Rolls-Royce by sticking the Spirit of Ecstasy onto a Nissan Micra. Qatar have understood what many Westerners also believe, that product symbols are often more valuable than the product itself, and this makes university franchises the perfect vehicle for projecting Qatari ideology abroad. Education City is a Qatari project to bring American universities to Qatar, specifically stating as part of the deal that those campuses must be capable of giving degrees from their parent universities back in America and the West. Virginia Commonwealth, Cornell, Texas A&M, Carnegie Mellon, Georgetown, Northwestern, HEC Paris, and University College London are all franchising their credentials in Qatar. But can their standards of education ever be so high in a country which adheres to Puritan Wahhabi Islam? Qatar states that these educational and research institutions have total academic and intellectual freedom. But just as radicalism grows on Western campuses funded by Qatar, academics at Education City have been censored for their portrayal of Qatari life. Love Comes Later, a book written by an English professor in Education City, was banned by the state of Qatar with no explanation. Qatar have given $5.6 billion to 81 American universities since 2007, including Georgetown, Carnegie Mellon, Virginia Commonwealth, Yale, and Stanford. Harvard have received $8 million since 2020 alone. Texas A&M have received $404 million since 2015, Northwestern $600 million, and Cornell $1.5 billion since 2015. And all while Al Jazeera provides positive coverage of students who openly back Hamas. Already, Jewish students are being threatened and proscribed terrorist organizations are being celebrated on these US college campuses. Harvard's president has had to resign over anti-Semitism, instances of which are around 3 times higher at universities which receive Qatari funding than those which do not. Qatar may be a country which can buy our institutions, but it is not yet a country which could build or maintain those institutions themselves. Don't slide into the trap of believing that Qatari joint ventures are establishing the liberal Western consensus on Qatari frontiers. By giving Qatar insider status on their own outsider terms, they are colonizing us and not the other way around. Our relationship with Qatar is becoming an unholy alliance of 2 types of radicalism. The first is the type which stands for an ideology which will not compromise or surrender to anyone. The second is the type which surrenders on all fronts to a tragic attempt to accommodate the first. Against this backdrop of our capitulation, Qatar remain intent on using their wealth to secure their future global position and replace the USA as the strategic power broker in the Middle East. Having helped America to depose Saddam Hussein in Iraq and during the evacuation of Afghanistan that swept the Taliban back into power, Washington tenuously held on to the idea that Qatar is a major non-NATO ally of the West. But Western claims to being in control of this strategic situation are looking a bit tenuous, given that Qatar have friendly relations with Iran and Russia and actually host the Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Doha while sending Hamas $30 million a month. America share the Al Udeid airbase, the largest in the Middle East, with the Qatari Air Force, which contributes to around 60% of the cost of the base. Now, the West can tell itself that we benefit from these types of strategic cooperations, but is Qatar paying for 60% of America's war against extremism in the Middle East, or is the West paying for 40% of the extremists' war against the West? If Qatari money can buy domestic opposition to the allies of the USA while Qatar collaborates with the enemies of the USA on active war fronts, then the $2 trillion American defense budget starts to look a little bit futile. If evidence were ever needed that you cannot surrender on all fronts and yet remain politically neutral, it is Qatar's subversion of the European Union. Now remember, around 2.5 million people live in Qatar, but fewer than 300,000 of those residents are actual citizens. Most are foreign paid workers, building the hotels, airports, and the infrastructure needed for Qatar's long-term prosperity, and these people have no rights to a share in the wealth that Qatar is generating. In Europe, this would constitute a human rights travesty, and we boycott other nations for less. But the Qatari government have discovered that they can bribe NGOs and politicians with suitcases of cash to keep quiet about what is going on and maintain Western support. In the run-up to the 2022 Qatar World Cup, none other than the Vice Chairman of the European Parliament was leading the opposition to a resolution critical of human rights in Qatar and attempting to broker a deal with Doha that would allow its citizens to travel to the EU without a visa. I alone said that Qatar is a front-runner in labour rights, said Eva Kaili. Still, some here are calling to discriminate them. They bully them, and they accuse anyone that talks to them or engages with them of corruption. Shortly after she made this speech, Kaili received a text from Qatar's NATO envoy. "Hi Eva," wrote Abdulaziz bin Ahmed Al-Malki in a WhatsApp message. "My dear, my ministry doesn't want paragraph A about the FIFA and Qatar. Please do your best to remove it via voting before 12 noon or during the voting, please." Soon after, Kaili was arrested while trying to hide a suitcase of cash in her Brussels flat. Cash which had been given to her lover by the Qatari government in order to manipulate the EU Parliament to overlook Qatar's human rights record. The pair had even written the Qatari minister's speech that he gave to the European Parliament. During this Qatargate scandal, 1.5 million euros of cash was found in at least 20 raids on homes, offices and hotel rooms across Belgium, France and Italy. Lobbyists, trade unionists, NGO directors and political operators were receiving hundreds of thousands of euros to encourage Europe's most senior lawmakers to turn a blind eye to Qatar's activities and promote its interests. Such was the keenness of European bureaucrats to win favour and money from Qatar that they even took advantage of Qatari ignorance of the EU systems of governance, telling Qatari ministers that they could produce successful results in fields where in fact they had no influence at all. It may seem that we are giving Qatar a mixed message by supporting them militarily and politically, even as they support enemies of the West. But these apparent contradictions send a very clear message to Doha and its radical allies that we will allow anyone who can pay us to enjoy an a la carte relationship with the West because the West will no longer defend its own interests.